In the remote Wisconsin countryside of 1854, a scandal so horrific unfolded that the Catholic Church has spent over 160 years trying to bury it. What began as a seemingly peaceful convent dedicated to caring for orphans and healing the sick would become the site of systematic disappearances, human trafficking, and murder on an unprecedented scale. The morning fog rolled heavy across Lake Michigan as Bishop William Quarter's carriage approached what would become St. Mary's Convent. The Catholic Church had purchased this sprawling estate, a former lumber baron's mansion surrounded by 30 acres of dense woodland. With grand ambitions, they envisioned the first major Catholic institution in the largely Protestant Wisconsin territory, a beacon of faith in America's rapidly expanding frontier. The limestone mansion stood imposing against the wilderness landscape. Its 3 wings and bell tower seemed to watch over the surrounding countryside with Gothic arches and narrow windows that resembled eyes. The central building, constructed in 1842, featured architectural elements that would later prove far more sinister than anyone could imagine. 2 wings extended from either side, the east for the nuns' quarters, the west for the proposed orphanage and infirmary. Behind the main structure rose a small chapel, its spire visible for miles across the flat Wisconsin plains. Local Protestant families viewed the arriving nuns with deep suspicion. Their black habits and Irish accents marked them as outsiders in a community dominated by German and Scandinavian settlers. The region's residents, primarily Lutheran and Methodist, had grown comfortable with the simple democratic structure of their own religious communities. The hierarchical nature of Catholicism, with its rituals and secrets, felt foreign and threatening. On the day of the convent's consecration, Elijah Hoffman, a respected elder at the local Lutheran church, muttered to his companions as he watched the black-robed figures process into the chapel, "Papists." His friend Wilhelm Schmidt nodded grimly. "My grandfather fled Germany to escape Catholic persecution." This sentiment, though not universal, reflected the deep religious tensions that would form the backdrop for the tragedy to come. Bishop Quarter announced to the small gathering of clergy and local dignitaries that St. Mary's would serve as a beacon of God's mercy in this wilderness. Under the guidance of Mother Superior Catherine Murphy, this convent would offer shelter to orphans, comfort to widows, and healing to the sick. The bishop introduced the 3 women who would lead the convent, all supposedly from established convents in the East. Mother Superior Catherine stood tall and imposing in her crisp black habit, her sharp features and penetrating gaze commanding instant respect. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to authority. Those who met her often commented on her eyes, an unusual pale blue that seemed to see through pretense. Sister Elizabeth, 38, with her perpetual smile and soft voice, would oversee the orphanage. Plump and maternal, with rosy cheeks and gentle hands, she seemed perfectly suited to care for abandoned children. When she spoke, it was always with a slight hesitation, as if carefully considering each word, a trait that many initially interpreted as thoughtfulness rather than calculation. Sister Margaret, 35, with her extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, would establish the infirmary. Tall and thin, with a serious demeanor and nimble fingers, she carried herself with the precision of someone who measured medicines by the drop. Her dark eyes missed nothing, and her knowledge of both traditional and modern medical practices had impressed physicians in Boston and New York. 20 younger nuns, most in their 20s and newly arrived from Ireland, completed the founding community. They stood in a perfect line, habits crisp, heads bowed in appropriate humility as Bishop Quarter blessed each by name. Sister Agnes O'Connor, Sister Bernadette Walsh, Sister Teresa Donovan, Sister Mary Collins, young women who had left behind family and homeland to serve God in a strange new country. "The Lord has called us to this wilderness," Mother Catherine addressed her sisters that first evening. Candlelight cast long shadows across the refectory. The smell of fresh bread and weak tea hung in the air, and the chill of the Wisconsin autumn seeped through the stone walls despite the large fireplace. "We will face hardships unknown to our Eastern counterparts. We will encounter suspicion from those who fear our faith, but we shall overcome through devotion and sacrifice." The young nuns, far from home and family, clung to her words like a lifeline in this strange new world. Sister Agnes whispered to Sister Bernadette as they prepared for bed that night, their narrow cots separated by barely an arm's length in the dormitory-style sleeping quarters. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the brave face she had maintained all day. Sister Bernadette squeezed her hand in the darkness. "They feared our Lord, too, at first." The whispered conversation ended abruptly at the sound of footsteps in the corridor, Mother Catherine making her rounds, ensuring all was in order on their first night. The convent quickly established itself as a functioning religious community. The daily rhythm of prayers began with matins at 3 in the morning. The bell's toll cut through the pre-dawn darkness, summoning sleepy nuns from warm beds to cold chapel floors. The distinctive drone of Latin chants filled the chapel 7 times daily. From those early morning prayers through to Compline at 9 in the evening, the sound became as much a part of the local landscape as the wind through the pines or the distant lowing of cattle. Between prayers, the nuns operated a small orphanage for abandoned children, tended the sick in a modest infirmary, and maintained extensive vegetable gardens. Their days followed a strict schedule: prayer, work, simple meals, brief recreation, more prayer. A rhythm designed to focus the mind on God and service rather than individual comfort or desire. By the winter of 1854, the orphanage housed 12 children, mostly the offspring of Irish immigrant laborers who had died in railway or lumber accidents. Sister Elizabeth oversaw their care with apparent tenderness, teaching basic letters and numbers alongside Catholic doctrine. On Sundays, local families would sometimes visit after Mass, bringing small treats for the children and occasionally inquiring about adoption. Sister Margaret's infirmary began modestly but quickly gained respect among local families. Her knowledge of traditional remedies proved effective, especially during the harsh Wisconsin winter when doctor visits required dangerous travel through snow-choked roads. Their self-sufficiency impressed even the most skeptical neighbors, and gradually the local attitude shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. "They keep to themselves, but they do good work," admitted Elijah Hoffman grudgingly to his congregation after Sister Margaret had successfully treated his grandson's persistent cough. Sister Agnes O'Connor, at 23, among the youngest nuns at St. Mary's, wrote letters home to Ireland that provide a rare glimpse into the early days of the convent. Her careful penmanship filled pages with observations about her new life, though close readers might note the gradually changing tone as months passed. "The work is harder than I ever imagined," she wrote in December 1854. The paper bearing smudges suggesting tears had fallen as she wrote, "My hands are raw from washing linens in ice-cold water, and the chapel stones feel like ice beneath our knees during morning prayers." What these letters did not reveal, what Sister Agnes herself might not have fully comprehended, were the subtle changes already taking place within St. Mary's walls. Mother Catherine's leadership style, initially merely strict, had begun to shift toward the autocratic. Minor infractions of convent rules previously addressed with gentle correction now resulted in increasingly severe penances. By the spring of 1855, St. Mary's had gained a reputation for exceptional charity. When a measles epidemic swept through the nearby lumber camps, Sister Margaret's infirmary treated dozens of workers regardless of their faith. The convent began receiving modest donations from grateful families, and even Protestant ministers acknowledged the good work being done behind those limestone walls. What no one outside the convent realized was that life inside St. Mary's was changing in subtle, disturbing ways. The communal meals had become increasingly silent affairs, with nuns keeping their eyes fixed on their bowls of thin soup or plates of plain bread. The recreation hour, once filled with quiet conversation and occasional laughter, grew tense and muted. Young women who had crossed an ocean together, bonded by shared purpose and faith, now moved like shadows, careful not to draw attention. The first strange occurrence came in April 1855 when Sister Agnes failed to appear for morning prayers. Her absence was immediately noticed. One empty place in the chapel where 20 nuns should stand in perfect formation. The other sisters exchanged quick, concerned glances as Mother Catherine entered, her expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "Sister Agnes has been called to assist at our mission in Minnesota," Mother Catherine announced to the bewildered community at breakfast, her tone brooking no questions. Her departure was sudden, as such callings often are. Sister Bernadette's spoon clattered against her bowl. "But Mother, she said nothing to me, and She fell silent as Mother Catherine's pale eyes fixed on her face. The question hung in the air like frost. "No, Mother, forgive me." Sister Bernadette lowered her eyes to her cooling porridge. No one had seen Sister Agnes pack or leave, and she had mentioned nothing of a transfer in her letters home. But in the strict hierarchy of convent life, no one dared question Mother Superior's explanation further. That evening in the dormitory, several nuns noticed Sister Agnes's few possessions were gone, as if she had indeed packed and departed. But Sister Mary Collins, whose cot had been beside Agnes's, whispered to Sister Teresa Donovan during their brief moments alone in the garden. Her cloak still hung on its peg. Sister Teresa glanced nervously toward the convent windows. Perhaps she was given a new one for the journey. 3 months later, Sister Bernadette Walsh vanished in similar fashion. "The bishop has requested Sister Bernadette's assistance with a delicate matter in Chicago," Mother Catherine explained. Again, no farewell, no warning, just an empty cell and a hastily provided explanation. By the winter of 1855, 3 more nuns had transferred to distant missions. Each departure followed the same pattern. A young nun, usually one who had drawn attention for her beauty or gentle nature, would simply fail to appear one morning. Mother Catherine would announce her reassignment, always to a location too distant for easy verification. Letters sent by worried families to these supposed new assignments would return months later with brief, oddly formal responses that provided few details of their new lives. The responses, when examined years later by handwriting experts, would all be identified as written by the same person, not the missing nuns themselves. Sister Teresa Donovan was one of the few who dared voice concerns. Tall and strong from years of farm work before taking her vows, with a directness unusual in convent life, she had already drawn Mother Catherine's disapproval for questioning the increasing severity of penances assigned to younger nuns. It seemed strange that Rome would request so many transfers without proper documentation. she whispered to Sister Mary Collins as they worked in the garden in the summer of 1856, their fingers stained with soil as they harvested early carrots. "And have you noticed it's always the youngest and prettiest who are called away? First Agnes with her golden hair, then Bernadette with those lovely singing voice, then Catherine with her perfect complexion, and Josephine with her—" She trailed off as a shadow fell across the garden bed. Sister Mary hushed her immediately, glancing nervously toward the convent windows where Sister Margaret stood watching, her thin face expressionless. "Mother Catherine has her reasons." The following week, Sister Teresa was gone, called to a contemplative retreat in Montreal, was the official explanation provided at morning prayers. Sister Mary, now thoroughly frightened, kept her head down and her thoughts to herself. That evening, as she made her bed, she found a small piece of paper tucked beneath her pillow. A page torn from Sister Teresa's prayer book with a hastily scrawled message in the margin. "Something is wrong." By 1857, the pattern had become impossible to ignore within the convent walls. Of the original 20 junior nuns, only 12 remained. The official explanations continued. Special missions, retreats, transfers to nursing positions during disease outbreak. To the outside world, St. Mary's continued to function normally. Local families still brought sick relatives to Sister Margaret's infirmary. Orphans still received care in Sister Elizabeth's orphanage. Sunday visitors saw nothing amiss in the solemn processions of black-clad figures moving from chapel to garden to refectory. But inside those limestone walls, fear had become a tangible presence. The remaining nuns spoke in whispers, avoided being alone, and watched in terror as their numbers dwindled. Mother Catherine's leadership grew more authoritarian. Minor infractions of convent rules resulted in severe penances, days of fasting, nights spent in prayer on cold stone floors, public confessions of increasingly intimate sins. One unusually cold night in January 1858, Sister Mary Collins awoke to muffled sounds from the cell next to hers. Through the thin wall she could hear Sister Rebecca Murphy sobbing, then a sharp whisper she recognized as Mother Catherine's voice. "You will come with us now." The sound of shuffling feet followed, then silence. Sister Mary lay frozen in her narrow bed, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her wakefulness. The floorboards in the corridor creaked. 1, 2, 3 sets of footsteps moving away from Sister Rebecca's cell. Then a sound that would haunt Sister Mary's dreams for years to come. A muffled cry quickly silenced, followed by what sounded like a body being dragged rather than walking of its own accord. The next morning, Mother Catherine announced that Sister Rebecca had been called to serve at a frontier mission in the Dakota Territory. Mother Catherine's pale eyes swept the refectory, lingering momentarily on Sister Mary. That afternoon, while sweeping the corridor outside Mother Catherine's office, Sister Mary overheard a disturbing conversation. The heavy oak door was not quite closed, and voices carried clearly to where she stood, dust brush suddenly motionless in her hand. "The doctor says this one will fetch a higher price." Sister Elizabeth's usually gentle voice had taken on a cold, calculating tone that Sister Mary would not have recognized had she not been listening at that very door. "We need to be more careful with the timing," Sister Margaret replied, the sound of glass clinking suggesting she was organizing her medicines as she spoke. 3 in 1 month raises questions. The bishop is easily managed." Mother Catherine's dismissive laugh sent chills down Sister Mary's spine. "Another donation to his cathedral fund and his questions will disappear. Besides, we've established the pattern well enough." Sister Margaret asked, her voice dropping lower. "She watches too closely." A moment of silence followed, during which Sister Mary's heart nearly stopped. "We'll wait," Mother Catherine finally replied. She's too plain to fetch much, and she has that correspondence with her brother in the seminary. Disappearing too many at once attracts attention. Sister Mary fled before she could be discovered, her mind racing. What had happened to her missing sisters? What terrible fate had befallen Sister Rebecca just last night? And who was the doctor they mentioned? The pieces began to fall into terrible place in her mind. The missing nuns, always the youngest and most attractive. The strange visits from well-dressed benefactors who toured the convent with Mother Catherine. The unexplained sounds sometimes heard from the locked north wing at night. The growing wealth of the convent despite its supposedly humble means. After a sleepless night of prayer and deliberation, Sister Mary made a desperate decision. During her weekly duty collecting eggs from the chicken coop, the only time she was permitted beyond the convent walls without supervision, she slipped a hastily written note into the pocket of Jimmy Fletcher, the 12-year-old son of a local farmer who delivered milk to the convent each morning. "Please deliver this to Father Thomas at St. Joseph's Church in town," she whispered, pressing a small silver cross into the boy's hand. The cross had been her confirmation gift, the only item of value she possessed. "Tell no one else." The boy nodded solemnly, his freckled face serious beyond his years. "Yes, sister." The note, which has been preserved in diocesan records, read simply, "Something evil happens at St. Mary's. Nuns disappearing, not sent away as claimed. I fear for my life. Please send help." What followed would expose one of the most horrific cases of religious corruption in American history. A systematic operation of human trafficking and murder that had operated under the sacred protection of the Catholic Church for years. The courage of one desperate nun and a farm boy would finally bring light to the darkness that had consumed St. Mary's Convent, though the full truth would prove more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The investigation that followed would reveal that the three women leading St. Mary's were not legitimate religious leaders at all, but criminals who had infiltrated the Catholic system to create a sophisticated network of human trafficking. Using the convent as cover, they had been systematically abducting, abusing, and selling young nuns to brothels across the Midwest, while murdering those who resisted. This is a story the Catholic Church has tried to bury for over a century and a half. But the voices of those who suffered and those who fought to expose the truth deserve to be heard. Sister Mary Collins pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs as voices drifted from Mother Catherine's partially open office door. What she heard next would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about St. Mary's Convent. The systematic disappearances had not gone unnoticed by those still trapped within the limestone walls. By the winter of 1858, the atmosphere inside St. Mary's had grown suffocating. The remaining nuns moved like ghosts through their daily routines, their eyes darting nervously toward empty cells that had once housed their sisters. The official explanations continued to flow from Mother Catherine's lips with practiced ease, but doubt had taken root among even the most devout. Sister Mary had begun keeping her own careful count. 23 nuns had arrived with such hope in 1854. Now only 8 remained, not counting the 3 who ruled over them with increasing severity. The mathematics of their situation was impossible to ignore. Yet questioning Mother Catherine's authority remained unthinkable for most of the survivors. The breaking point came during a bitter February night when Sister Mary witnessed something that would haunt her for the remainder of her days. Unable to sleep due to a persistent cough that echoed through the thin walls, she had risen from her narrow cot to fetch water from the kitchen. The convent should have been silent at that hour, wrapped in the peaceful stillness that follows Compline prayers. Instead, she heard voices coming from the direction of the north wing. Male voices, rough and unfamiliar, mixed with what sounded like Mother Catherine's controlled tones. Sister Mary crept closer, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. Through a partially open door, she glimpsed a scene that defied comprehension. 3 men in expensive city clothes stood in what appeared to be a makeshift examination room. Sister Rebecca Murphy, who had supposedly departed for the Dakota Territory just weeks earlier, was secured to a wooden table. Her habit had been removed, replaced by a thin white shift that offered no dignity or warmth. Dr. Matthews, a man Sister Mary recognized from his periodic visits to treat the orphans, was conducting what could only be described as a medical examination of the most intimate and degrading nature. "This one will command a premium price," Dr. Matthews announced clinically, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Virginity intact, no signs of disease, excellent bone structure." Mother Catherine nodded approvingly, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. "The Chicago establishment has requested 3 more by month's end." Sister Margaret stood nearby, preparing what appeared to be a syringe filled with clear liquid. "The laudanum will keep her compliant during transport," she explained to the assembled men. One of the visiting men, distinguished-looking with silver hair and expensive jewelry, stepped closer to examine Sister Rebecca with the detached interest of someone appraising livestock. "She's younger than the usual merchandise." 19, Mother Catherine replied. "Fresh from Ireland, minimal education, no family connections to complicate matters." Sister Mary's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp of horror. Sister Rebecca's eyes were open but unfocused, clearly affected by whatever substance had been administered to her. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she stared at the ceiling, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. The silver-haired man reached into his coat and withdrew a substantial roll of currency. "The arrangement remains the same?" "Naturally," Mother Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her features into something predatory. "Our arrangements have always been final." Dr. Matthews completed his examination and began washing his hands in a basin held by Sister Margaret. "I'll need to examine the Collins girl soon," he mentioned casually. Sister Mary's blood turned to ice. They were discussing her as if she were already condemned. "Not yet," Mother Catherine replied thoughtfully. "Mary's plainness limits her commercial value, but her literacy makes her useful for correspondence. We'll wait until after Easter, when the bishop's visit is completed." The casual discussion of her fate as a commercial transaction finally broke through Sister Mary's paralysis. She crept back to her cell, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had witnessed. The missing sisters had not been transferred to distant missions. They had been sold into slavery, their religious vows perverted into a marketing advantage for wealthy men seeking to defile what should have been sacred. Sleep proved impossible. Sister Mary spent the remaining hours before Matins prayers wrestling with a terrible decision. To remain silent meant eventual doom not only for herself but for any other young women who might fall into Mother Catherine's web. Yet to speak out seemed equally hopeless. Who would believe such accusations against respected religious leaders? And even if someone did believe her, would they act in time to prevent further atrocities? The answer came during morning prayers as she knelt in the chapel, surrounded by the remaining fragments of their once hopeful community. Sister Bernadette O'Brien, barely 18 and recently arrived from County Cork, knelt nearby. Her clear voice rose in the Latin chants they had learned together, her face radiant with the faith that had brought her across an ocean to serve God in this remote place. Sister Mary realized with crystalline clarity that Sister Bernadette would be next. Young, beautiful, innocent, and utterly trusting in the authority of those who claim to represent Christ's church. The pattern was unmistakable. That afternoon, during her weekly duty collecting eggs from the chicken coop, Sister Mary made her desperate gamble. Young Jimmy Fletcher arrived as usual with the morning milk delivery, his freckled face serious as he went about his work. She had never spoken to him directly before. The rules governing interaction with outsiders were strict and heavily enforced. "Jimmy," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the convent windows. The boy looked up, startled. "Sister?" Sister Mary pressed a hastily written note into his hand along with her confirmation cross, the only item of value she possessed. "Take this to Father Thomas at St. Joseph's Church. Tell no one else and speak of this to no one." Jimmy's young face grew solemn as he recognized the weight of her request. "Yes, sister." As she watched him drive away, Sister Mary offered a prayer that her message would reach someone with both the authority and the courage to act. The note contained only the essential facts, written in her careful convent school hand. "Something evil happens at St. Mary's. Nuns disappearing, not sent away as claimed. I fear for my life. Please send help." The next few days passed in an agony of waiting and fear. Sister Mary maintained her normal routines while watching for any sign that her desperate gamble had been discovered. Mother Catherine's pale eyes seemed to follow her movements more closely than usual, though that might have been her imagination magnified by guilt and terror. The breakthrough came during the third night when Sister Mary was awakened by sounds from the corridor outside her cell. Through the thin wall she could hear Sister Bernadette sobbing. Then Mother Catherine's voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "You will come with us now." The sound of shuffling feet followed, then the distinctive scrape of a body being dragged rather than walking voluntarily. Sister Mary lay frozen in her narrow bed, listening to her worst fears being confirmed. Sister Bernadette's fate was being sealed just as Sister Rebecca's had been. By morning, Mother Catherine had her explanation ready. "Sister Bernadette has been called to assist at our mission school in Minnesota," she announced during breakfast. Sister Mary forced herself to nod along with the others, though her heart was screaming with rage and helplessness. How many more would disappear before help arrived? How many more young women would be sacrificed to Mother Catherine's grotesque interpretation of religious service? The answer came sooner than expected. Father Thomas Ryan had not ignored her desperate plea. Within days of receiving her note, he had begun his own careful investigation, culminating in his fateful visit to St. Mary's that would expose the full scope of the horror hidden behind the convent's respectable facade. But Sister Mary would never know the outcome of her brave act. On the very night that Father Ryan sent his urgent telegram to Archbishop Hughes requesting immediate intervention, Sister Mary Collins disappeared from her cell. Her body would later be found buried in the convent's vegetable garden, a small medallion of Saint Bridget clutched in her lifeless fingers. The soil over her grave was barely settled when Monsignor Kelly arrived with his inspection team, suggesting that Mother Catherine had eliminated the source of her troubles just as the investigation was beginning. Sister Mary's courage in reaching out for help had set in motion the events that would ultimately save the remaining victims, but she paid for that courage with her life. Her sacrifice was not in vain. The note delivered by young Jimmy Fletcher had broken through the wall of silence and complicity that had protected Mother Catherine's operation for years. Though Sister Mary would not live to see justice served, her desperate act of courage in the face of overwhelming evil had lit the flame that would finally illuminate the darkness consuming St. Mary's Convent. When investigators later found her remains, they also discovered a small piece of paper sewn into the lining of her habit. The investigation that followed would reveal horrors that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. But it began with one young woman's refusal to remain silent in the face of unspeakable evil. When Father Thomas Ryan's investigation threatened to expose the truth, the conspirators moved with ruthless efficiency. The morning after his unexpected visit, Mother Catherine convened an emergency meeting in the sealed chambers beneath the chapel. Sister Margaret's medical supplies were redistributed. Compromising evidence was burned in the kitchen stove, and most critically, the remaining imprisoned nuns were prepared for immediate disposal. But the cover-up had already begun to unravel. Archbishop Hughes's inspector arrived with federal marshals just hours before the final phase of Mother Catherine's plan could be executed. What they discovered in those underground chambers would haunt investigators for decades. The systematic nature of the operation, the meticulous record-keeping, and the sheer scale of human trafficking disguised as religious mission work revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. The financial records alone told a story of staggering corruption. Over 8 years, the false nuns had generated more than $100,000 in revenue through their trafficking network. That's equivalent to roughly $3 million in today's currency. Coded ledgers detailed transactions with brothels across the Midwest, with entries like package delivered to Chicago establishment, condition excellent, commission $400. Sitting alongside routine convent expenses for candles and prayer books. The medical examinations conducted by Dr. William Matthews served a dual purpose. Beyond certifying the health of victims, he provided documentation of virginity that significantly increased their value in specialized brothels, catering to wealthy clients with particular preferences. His clinical notes, discovered in Sister Margaret's quarters, described procedures that would be considered torture by modern standards, all conducted under the guise of ensuring the spiritual purity of the vessels. Most disturbing were the detailed maps found in Mother Catherine's private study. These documents revealed a network of similar operations stretching from New Orleans to San Francisco, with St. Mary's serving as merely one node in a vast web of religious exploitation. Correspondence with other convents used coded language to arrange transfers, share techniques, and coordinate with clients who traveled between cities seeking their particular form of depravity. The investigation uncovered evidence of political protection that reached the highest levels of state government. Bank records showed regular payments to officials who ensured that missing person reports were misfiled, that transportation permits were expedited without scrutiny, and that potential witnesses found themselves facing unrelated legal troubles that silenced their testimony. When authorities finally excavated the convent gardens, they found more than just the 4 bodies initially discovered. Ground-penetrating equipment revealed disturbed earth throughout the property, suggesting dozens of additional graves. The limestone foundation of the chapel itself had been constructed over what appeared to be a mass burial site, with fragments of religious habits and human remains mixed into the mortar. The escape of Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret from their locked cells remained one of the investigation's most baffling aspects. The heavy iron doors showed no signs of forced entry. The windows remained sealed from the inside, and the guards reported no unusual sounds during the night. It was only when investigators examined the original architectural plans of the lumber baron's mansion that they discovered the truth. Hidden passages originally designed for discreet business meetings during the rough frontier days had been modified to connect the residential wing with the underground chambers, and ultimately to a concealed exit near the lakeshore. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. Sister Elizabeth, in her catatonic state, began speaking during the night hours at the asylum. Her fractured testimony, recorded by night attendants, revealed the existence of the Master, a figure who had orchestrated the entire network from behind the scenes. According to her rambling accounts, this individual had recruited and trained the three women specifically for the St. Mary's operation, providing them with false credentials, startup funds, and ongoing protection from legal consequences. The identity of this master remained one of the case's greatest mysteries. References in the recovered documents suggested someone with extensive knowledge of both religious institutions and criminal enterprises, possibly a defrocked priest or corrupt church official operating across multiple states. His influence appeared to extend into banking, law enforcement, and even the federal government, explaining how such a vast operation could function with minimal interference for so many years. As news of the St. Mary's horror spread across the nation, it triggered a broader examination of religious institutions throughout America. The case exposed fundamental weaknesses in the oversight of convents, orphanages, and charitable organizations, leading to the first comprehensive reforms in religious institution management since the colonial period. But it also revealed something darker about American society: the willingness of respectable citizens to ignore obvious signs of abuse when it occurred behind sacred walls. The psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond the immediate trauma of their captivity. Many reported persistent nightmares, an inability to trust religious authority, and a profound sense of betrayal that affected their capacity for human connection for the remainder of their lives. The Church's response, emphasizing silence and forgiveness over justice and healing, compounded their suffering and established patterns of institutional denial that would persist well into the modern era. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that the St. Mary's operation had been planned as a prototype for a national network of similar facilities. Documents found in Mother Catherine's study outlined plans for expansion into territories throughout the American West, taking advantage of the lack of established law enforcement and the isolation of frontier communities. The gold rush in California had created opportunities for specialized brothels catering to wealthy miners, while the expansion of the railroad system provided efficient transportation for trafficking victims across vast distances. The investigation revealed that several other religious institutions had already been infiltrated by associates of the St. Mary's conspirators. A convent in Colorado Territory was discovered to be operated by women using forged credentials remarkably similar to those employed by Mother Catherine's group. An orphanage in New Mexico had been accepting children who were never officially registered, suggesting they were being prepared for sale into various forms of exploitation. The fate of the 14 nuns who were never accounted for haunted investigators for years. Periodic reports from missionaries and law enforcement across the American frontier suggested that some had been sold to operations in remote mining camps, cattle ranches and frontier settlements where they lived in conditions of virtual slavery. Others appeared to have been transported to international destinations, with unconfirmed sightings in Cuba, Mexico, and even as far away as the Orient, where American women commanded premium prices in specialized establishments. The final chapter of the St. Mary's saga revealed the true extent of institutional complicity in the cover-up. Internal church documents not released until nearly a century later showed that Vatican officials had been aware of irregularities in American frontier convents as early as 1850. Rather than launching a comprehensive investigation, they had chosen to handle the matter through discreet channels that prioritized protecting the Church's reputation over safeguarding potential victims. This preference for institutional preservation over individual justice would become a recurring theme in the Church's response to abuse cases throughout American history. The techniques developed to contain the St. Mary's scandal, relocating survivors to ensure silence, destroying compromising documents, and characterizing systemic problems as isolated incidents, became the template for managing similar crises for generations to come. Today, the land where St. Mary's Convent once stood hosts a suburban development whose residents remain unaware of the horrors that occurred beneath their foundations. But the legacy of those events continues to resonate through American religious institutions, serving as a stark reminder of what can happen when authority operates without accountability and when the vulnerable are placed at the mercy of those who view them not as human beings deserving of protection, but as commodities to be exploited for profit and power. The courage of Sister Mary Collins, who risked everything to slip a desperate note to a farm boy, ultimately saved the lives of the 5 women found imprisoned in that locked room. Her sacrifice and the determination of Father Thomas Ryan to pursue the truth despite official discouragement stand as testament to the power of individual conscience in confronting institutional evil. As darkness fell over the limestone walls of St. Mary's Convent on that fateful April evening in 1858, the investigation had already uncovered horrors that would shake the very foundations of faith in Wisconsin Territory. What Father Thomas Ryan and Monsignor Kelly discovered behind those locked doors was merely the beginning of a revelation that would expose the true depth of evil that had taken root within what was supposed to be sacred ground. The rescue of the 5 imprisoned nuns from their windowless cell had provided crucial testimony, but as investigators pressed deeper into the convent's hidden chambers, they began to understand that Mother Catherine Murphy and her accomplices had created something far more sinister than a simple case of religious abuse. They had engineered a systematic operation that turned faith itself into a commodity and human suffering into profit. Sister Rebecca Murphy, now free from her captivity but bearing the physical and psychological scars of months of torment, provided investigators with details that painted a picture of calculated evil. Her voice, barely above a whisper from weeks of screaming that had gone unheard, revealed the true scope of what had been happening within St. Mary's walls. The men who came after evening prayers, she explained, were not random criminals, but wealthy patrons who paid premium prices for what Mother Catherine marketed as the ultimate transgression against God. These clients, she revealed, came from the highest levels of society. Judges from Milwaukee, bank presidents from Chicago, even state legislators who traveled under cover of darkness to participate in what Mother Catherine called spiritual purification through violation. The perverted theology she had constructed justified every horror by claiming that the suffering of the nuns was necessary for the salvation of their abusers. Pain became prayer. Violation became sacrament, and murder became ascension to heaven. The financial records discovered in Mother Catherine's hidden safe told their own horrifying story. Coded entries detailed not just the trafficking of individual nuns, but an entire network of operations extending throughout the Midwest. References to acquisition suggested that young women were being systematically abducted from isolated farms and settlements, processed through St. Mary's, and then distributed to brothels and private clients across multiple states. One ledger entry dated just weeks before the investigation contained details that made even hardened investigators recoil in horror. It described the preparation of Sister Josephine Brady, who had been 5 months pregnant when rescued, for what was termed a special commission. The client, identified only by initials that matched those of a prominent Chicago industrialist, had specifically requested a pregnant nun for what the entry described as a ceremony of double blessing. The price listed was $1,500, more than most frontier families earned in 3 years. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from a collection of letters found sewn into the lining of Sister Margaret's medicine chest. These correspondence revealed that the St. Mary's operation was not unique, but rather part of a larger network that extended far beyond Wisconsin's borders. Letters from New Orleans described similar establishments operating under the guise of charitable institutions. Correspondence from San Francisco detailed the successful establishment of what was called a contemplative retreat that catered to wealthy clients seeking unusual spiritual experiences. Most chilling was a letter from Havana, Cuba, dated just months before the investigation. It described the successful establishment of a finishing school for young ladies that was already generating substantial profits, congratulated Mother Catherine on her successful methods, and requested additional training materials for expanding operations to Mexico City. The writer mentioned that certain government officials had been most accommodating once they understood the financial benefits of protecting such an enterprise. As investigators continued their grim work of excavating the convent grounds, they discovered that the vegetable garden concealed far more than the 4 bodies initially found. Ground-penetrating surveys revealed at least 12 additional burial sites scattered throughout the property. Some graves contained the remains of nuns who had resisted too strongly, while others held the bodies of young women who had never been officially connected to the convent at all. The medical examination of these remains, primitive by modern standards but thorough for the 1850s, revealed disturbing patterns. Many of the victims showed evidence of prolonged torture before death. Broken bones that had been allowed to heal improperly suggested weeks or months of systematic abuse. Most disturbing of all, several of the bodies showed signs of having been buried alive, their final positions indicating desperate struggles against suffocation. Dr. Samuel Prescott, the Albany physician who conducted the examinations, noted in his official report that the level of cruelty inflicted upon these women exceeded anything he had encountered in his 20 years of medical practice. The perpetrators, he concluded, had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy that allowed them to inflict maximum suffering while keeping their victims alive for extended periods. The investigation also revealed the true fate of many nuns who had supposedly been transferred to distant missions. Correspondence with brothel owners in Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans confirmed that at least 14 of the missing women had been sold into sexual slavery. Their religious background, far from being an obstacle to their exploitation, was marketed as their primary attraction. Wealthy clients paid premium prices for the opportunity to violate women who had dedicated their lives to God. One particularly disturbing letter from a Chicago brothel owner, dated 6 months before the investigation, described the condition of former St. Mary's nuns in his establishment. Several had died from disease or suicide within their first year of captivity. Others had suffered complete mental breakdowns and were being kept in basement cells for clients with especially depraved tastes. The letter concluded with a request for younger replacements, noting that the religious market was proving exceptionally profitable despite the high mortality rate among the merchandise. The scope of the corruption extended far beyond the convent itself. As investigators followed the paper trail of financial transactions, they discovered that the St. Mary's operation had been protected by a network of complicit officials at every level of government and church hierarchy. Sheriff's deputies had been paid to ignore reports of suspicious activity. County judges had dismissed complaints from families seeking missing daughters. Even federal postal inspectors had been bribed to intercept letters that might have exposed the operation. Most shocking of all was the discovery of Bishop Henny's personal correspondence with Mother Catherine. The letters, found in a secret compartment behind his office altar, revealed that he had not merely been negligent in his oversight, but had been an active participant in the conspiracy. In exchange for substantial donations to his cathedral building fund, he had provided Mother Catherine with advance warning of any investigations and had personally vouched for her character to suspicious families. One letter, dated just 2 months before the investigation, showed the bishop's direct involvement in covering up the murder of Sister Teresa Donovan. When a local farmer had discovered blood-stained nuns' clothing in the woods near St. Mary's, Bishop Henny had personally convinced the man that it was merely theatrical props from a religious pageant. The letter concluded with instructions for disposing of Sister Teresa's remaining personal effects and forging documentation of her supposed transfer to Montreal. The revelation of ecclesiastical corruption sent shockwaves through Catholic communities across the Midwest. Families who had trusted their daughters to the Church's care now questioned whether similar operations might be hidden behind other respectable facades. Protestant communities, already suspicious of Catholic institutions, seized upon the scandal as confirmation of their worst fears about papal influence in America. But even as the investigation continued to uncover new horrors, the masterminds of the operation were successfully executing their escape plan. Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark had vanished so completely that some investigators began to suspect supernatural intervention. The locked room from which they had disappeared showed no signs of forced exit, leading to speculation about secret passages or accomplices within the investigation team itself. The manhunt that followed was one of the most extensive in American history to that point. Federal marshals coordinated with local law enforcement across multiple states, while private detectives hired by the Church followed leads as far south as Mexico and as far east as New York. Wanted posters bearing detailed descriptions of both women were distributed to every major port and railway station in North America. Yet despite this massive effort, the fugitives seemed to stay perpetually one step ahead of their pursuers. Reported sightings placed them in New Orleans just days before authorities arrived. Witnesses claimed to have seen them boarding a ship to Havana, but searches of passenger manifests revealed no matching names. Most frustrating of all were reports from Mexico City describing two American women establishing a new charitable institution. But by the time investigators could follow up, the women had again vanished without a trace. The fate of their accomplice, James Callahan, provided the only measure of justice in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. Captured during a brothel raid in Chicago 6 months after the St. Mary's investigation, he was identified through testimony from the rescued nuns and subsequently charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial, conducted under heavy security due to fears of vigilante justice, revealed additional details about the operation's methods and scope. Callahan's testimony, given in exchange for a promise of life imprisonment rather than hanging, described an organization that had been years in the planning. Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret had spent months studying the layout of frontier convents, identifying the most isolated locations and the most vulnerable populations. They had carefully researched the backgrounds of local officials, identifying those most susceptible to bribery or intimidation. Most disturbing was Callahan's description of the selection process for victims. The women had developed detailed criteria for choosing nuns who would bring the highest prices in their underground market. Youth and beauty were obvious factors, but they also considered more subtle qualities: innocence that could be corrupted, strength that could be broken, and faith that could be perverted into despair. The psychological torture inflicted upon their victims was as carefully orchestrated as the physical abuse. Sister Margaret had developed techniques for breaking down the mental defenses of resistant nuns using a combination of isolation, drugging, and systematic violation of their most sacred beliefs. The goal was not merely to prepare them for sale, but to destroy their sense of self so completely that resistance became impossible. Callahan also revealed the existence of what he called the Master, a mysterious figure who apparently provided financial backing and protection for the entire operation. According to his testimony, this individual never visited St. Mary's directly but communicated through coded letters and intermediaries. The Master, Callahan claimed, had connections at the highest levels of both government and church hierarchy, connections that made the entire enterprise possible. When pressed for more details about this mysterious patron, Callahan became visibly agitated, claiming that even revealing the little he had already shared put his life in danger. He died in his cell 3 days before his scheduled execution, found hanging from a bedsheet that had been fashioned into a noose. Prison officials ruled it suicide, but the coroner noted that the positioning of the body was inconsistent with self-inflicted death. The investigation into Callahan's death was perfunctory at best, with authorities apparently eager to close the book on a case that had already generated too much uncomfortable publicity. The St. Mary's scandal had exposed corruption and complicity at levels that threatened the stability of both religious and secular institutions. As one federal investigator noted in his private journal, the full truth was too dangerous to reveal, as it would destroy public faith in the very systems meant to protect society's most vulnerable members. The surviving nuns faced challenges that the 19th century was ill-equipped to address. Modern understanding of trauma and its treatment was decades in the future, leaving these women to cope with their experiences using only the limited resources of religious faith and personal resilience. Most were dispersed to distant convents with strict instructions never to speak of what they had endured, effectively silencing the very witnesses whose testimony might have prevented similar tragedies. Sister Rebecca Murphy, who had provided the most detailed testimony about the operation, struggled for years with what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Transferred to a convent in Philadelphia, she was repeatedly disciplined for nighttime screaming and inappropriate behavior during religious services. Her letters to former St. Mary's survivors, discovered after her death in 1899, reveal a woman haunted by guilt over those who had not been rescued and by rage against a system that had failed so completely to protect them. The children who had been housed in St. Mary's orphanage faced their own uncertain futures. Many had witnessed events that no child should see, and several showed signs of having been abused themselves. The boys were typically placed with farming families as unpaid laborers, while the girls were sent to other religious institutions with carefully sanitized records that made no mention of their connection to the scandal. Perhaps most tragic was the fate of the infant born to Sister Josephine Brady during her captivity. Church officials determined to sever all connections to the St. Mary's scandal, placed the child with a family in Pennsylvania with strict instructions that the circumstances of her birth remain forever secret. Sister Josephine's desperate pleas to keep her child were dismissed as the ravings of a woman whose experiences had left her mentally unstable. The official church response to the scandal followed a pattern that would become depressingly familiar in later centuries. Acknowledge the minimum necessary facts, remove the immediate perpetrators, relocate the victims to ensure their silence, and implement cosmetic reforms that would prevent future embarrassment without addressing systemic problems. Archbishop Hughes's private correspondence reveals a man more concerned with damage control than with justice for the victims or meaningful institutional change. The physical evidence of what had occurred at St. Mary's was systematically destroyed in the months following the investigation. The convent buildings were demolished, the grounds were plowed under, and even the unmarked graves of the murdered nuns were built over without ceremony or acknowledgement. By 1860, no visible trace remained of what had once been a place of horror masquerading as a house of God. Yet the influence of the St. Mary's case extended far beyond its immediate victims. The scandal contributed to a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment that would persist for decades, with Protestant publications using the case as evidence of the inherent corruption of papal institutions. This religious prejudice would manifest in discrimination against Catholic immigrants and restrictions on Catholic institutional growth throughout the Midwest. More significantly, the St. Mary's case established patterns of institutional response to abuse that would be repeated countless times in the centuries that followed. The preference for secrecy over transparency, the protection of institutional reputation over victim welfare, and the treatment of systemic problems as isolated incidents created a template that would enable future tragedies. The mystery of what happened to Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark after their escape continues to generate speculation among historians and true crime enthusiasts. The most credible sightings placed them in Mexico, where they apparently established new operations under different identities. The discovery of their bodies in Veracruz in 1912 suggested that they had continued their criminal enterprise for nearly 2 decades after fleeing Wisconsin. The journal found with their remains contained entries that provided glimpses into their final years. References to new acquisitions and special clients suggested that they had indeed continued their human trafficking operations, adapting their methods to Mexican conditions and clientele. The final entry describing the imminent arrival of someone they called the Master remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of the entire case. Some researchers have theorized that this master was the financial backer who had made the original St. Mary's operation possible. Others suggest it might have been a code name for death itself, as the women faced the end of their ability to continue their crimes. The fact that both women died simultaneously, apparently from poison, suggests either a suicide pact or murder by an associate seeking to eliminate dangerous witnesses. The broader network revealed in the St. Mary's investigation was never fully exposed or dismantled. Reports of similar operations continued to surface sporadically throughout the late 19th century, always in isolated locations where religious institutions provided convenient cover for criminal enterprises. The template established by Mother Catherine and her accomplices proved disturbingly effective and adaptable. In the end, the true horror of St. Mary's Convent lies not just in the suffering inflicted upon its victims, but in the ease with which such an operation was able to function for years without detection. The combination of religious authority, social isolation, and institutional corruption created conditions that made systematic abuse not only possible but profitable. The story of St. Mary's serves as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability, and that the most vulnerable members of society require active protection rather than passive trust in institutions. The nuns who died within those limestone walls deserve to be remembered not as victims of an isolated tragedy, but as casualties of systemic failures that continue to threaten the innocent to this day. Their names, Sister Agnes O'Connor, Sister Bernarde Walsh, Sister Teresa Donovan, Sister Mary Collins, and all the others, represent more than historical footnotes. They were real women with hopes, dreams, and faith who trusted in a system that betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible. Their suffering mattered. Their courage in the face of unimaginable horror deserves recognition, and their deaths demand that we remain vigilant against the darkness that can take root when authority goes unchecked and victims go unheard. The Wisconsin countryside has long since healed the scars left by St. Mary's Convent, but the lessons of that tragedy remain as relevant today as they were in 1858. In a world where institutions still claim divine or moral authority, where the vulnerable still depend on the protection of the powerful, and where silence still too often shields the guilty while condemning the innocent, the story of St. Mary's stands as both warning and memorial. Remember them. Remember that they lived, that they suffered, and that their suffering mattered. The morning mist clung to the Wisconsin countryside like a shroud, as Father Thomas Ryan's urgent telegram reached Archbishop Hughes in New York. What had begun as whispered concerns about missing nuns was about to explode into the most damning scandal in American Catholic history. The year was 1858, and the carefully constructed facade of St. Mary's Convent was crumbling like ancient mortar. When Monsignor Patrick Kelly arrived unannounced at the convent gates that April morning, accompanied by Father Ryan and two senior priests, the reception they encountered spoke volumes. Mother Catherine Murphy, usually composed as marble, appeared flustered, her pale face flushed with what might have been anger or fear. Through open windows, the clerical party glimpsed young nuns hastily carrying armfuls of papers toward the kitchen, where the large cast-iron stove burned despite the season's warmth. The acrid smell of burning documents drifted through the courtyard like incense at a funeral mass. What Monsignor Kelly discovered behind that locked door in the north wing would haunt him for the remainder of his days. 5 nuns, including the missing Sister Rebecca Murphy, were confined in what had once been a storage room. The space, perhaps 15 feet square, contained only a chamber pot in the corner and thin pallets on the floor. The single high window had been boarded over, leaving the room in near darkness save for the light now streaming through the open door. The women were pale, malnourished, and showed unmistakable signs of physical abuse. Their habits were torn and soiled, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. One, later identified as Sister Josephine Brady, was heavily pregnant, her swollen belly incongruous against her thin limbs. The stench of unwashed bodies and human waste was overwhelming. Father Ryan turned aside momentarily, fighting nausea, while Monsignor Kelly crossed himself in horror. Sister Rebecca, once robust and quick to smile, now appeared as a skeletal figure with hollow eyes. She struggled to her feet when she recognized Father Ryan. Her words came in terrified whispers as Father Ryan helped her to a chair hastily brought from the corridor. "They're preparing us for the doctor." The doctor, she explained through trembling lips, was Dr. William Matthews, who came to examine them to determine which ones were suitable. "The men pay more for nuns," she whispered, her voice dropping so low the priests had to strain to hear. "For brides of Christ." While Father Ryan and Monsignor Kelly attended to the imprisoned nuns, ensuring they received water, food, and medical attention, the other priests made equally disturbing discoveries elsewhere in the convent. In Sister Margaret's private quarters, accessible only through a hidden door in the infirmary, they found shelves lined with suspicious medicines, laudanum, chloroform, and other substances typically used for rendering patients unconscious. A leather-bound journal detailed treatments administered to various nuns, with clinical notes about their responses and suitability for transport. The financial records revealed the true scope of the horror. While the convent reported minimal income from donations and manual work, its accounts showed regular, substantial deposits far exceeding what a frontier convent could legitimately earn. Most damning were coded entries referring to packages delivered and special commissions completed, each corresponding to the disappearance of a nun. Transferred Sister Agnes O'Connor, May 1855, commission $400, read one entry. Package delivered to Chicago establishment. Another, more disturbing, Sister Teresa Donovan, unsuitable for transfer due to resistance, terminated November 1856. Through patient questioning of the traumatized nuns, Monsignor Kelly pieced together the horrifying truth. Mother Catherine, Sister Elizabeth, and Sister Margaret were not legitimate religious leaders at all, but impostors who had infiltrated the Catholic system years earlier. Sister Claire O'Donnell, one of the rescued nuns, provided crucial testimony once she felt safe enough to speak. "I overheard them one night," she whispered, clutching a blanket around her shoulders despite the room's warmth. Mother Catherine was arguing with Sister Margaret about their past. She called her Catherine. The real Mother Catherine Murphy had died shortly after arriving in Wisconsin, poisoned according to testimony from Sister Margaret's former assistant in the infirmary. She added something to Mother Catherine's evening tea, the young nun testified. The original Mother Catherine began vomiting blood that very night. Sister Margaret diagnosed it as consumption and isolated her. The 3 senior nuns had then systematically taken control of the convent, establishing connections with a network of so-called houses of charity across the Midwest that were in reality brothels catering to wealthy clients with specific preferences. Young nuns who caught their attention, particularly those noted for their beauty, innocence, or gentle nature, were prepared for a terrible fate. First came isolation through increasingly severe penances for fabricated infractions. Then drugging, often with laudanum from Sister Margaret's medical supplies. The selected nuns would be violated within the convent itself by paying benefactors, wealthy men from Chicago, Milwaukee, and as far away as St. Louis, who paid premium prices for the opportunity to defile brides of Christ. They would come after Compline when the convent was supposed to be silent, Sister Rebecca explained, her voice emotionless, as if detachment was the only way she could relate such horrors. Men in fine clothes, smelling of cologne and whiskey. Mother Catherine would lead them to the north wing where we were kept. Those who became pregnant, like Sister Josephine, were kept isolated until delivery, after which they would be transported to brothels in Chicago or St. Louis, where they would be forced into prostitution. Their religious background and forced pregnancy were marketed as special attractions for depraved clients. Many died within years from disease or abuse. The orphanage served as both cover and additional source of victims. Older girls approaching puberty would suddenly be adopted by generous benefactors, in reality sold to the same network of brothels. Boys were indeed placed with families, but as unpaid farm laborers, with Mother Catherine collecting substantial placement fees. Most horrifying were the fates of those who resisted too strongly or threatened to expose the operation. Sister Teresa Donovan, who had questioned the disappearances, had not been sent to Montreal as claimed. According to testimony from Sister Rebecca, Teresa had been held in the locked room for weeks, repeatedly assaulted, and when her spirit remained unbroken, strangled by the man called Callahan. Her body, along with those of at least 3 other nuns who had similarly resisted, lay buried in unmarked graves in the convent's vegetable garden. Mother Catherine made us watch. Sister Claire said, tears streaming down her face. She said it was a lesson in obedience. Sister Teresa fought until the end. As evening fell on that fateful April day, Monsignor Kelly ordered the immediate closure of St. Mary's Convent. The surviving nuns were removed to safety. Local authorities were notified and guards were posted to prevent anyone from fleeing or removing evidence. Mother Catherine, Sister Elizabeth, and Sister Margaret were placed under ecclesiastical arrest, confined to their cells under watch until civil authorities could take custody. But the Church's attempt to handle the matter discreetly soon unraveled. Mr. Callahan, the burly enforcer who had been absent during the inspection, returned after nightfall. Finding the convent under guard, he fled to Chicago, where he apparently warned his associates. By the time local sheriffs arrived the following morning with arrest warrants, Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret had somehow escaped their confined quarters. Only Sister Elizabeth remained, found kneeling in the chapel in a state of catatonic shock. The subsequent civil investigation uncovered the full extent of the operation. Financial records seized from Mother Catherine's hidden safe revealed transactions totaling over $100,000, equivalent to roughly $3 million today. Over 8 years, coded ledgers identified 23 nuns and 17 orphaned girls who had been trafficked to brothels across the Midwest. Correspondence with business partners in Chicago, St. Louis, and even New Orleans detailed the specialized services offered and the premium prices commanded. A genuine sister of charity, untouched before our establishment, minimum $300. read one letter to a Chicago brothel owner. Special requests, habit, religious implements, additional $50 per session. The investigation extended to the convent grounds where, guided by the notebook's cryptic references, authorities excavated several areas of the vegetable garden. There they found the remains of 4 nuns buried in shallow graves among the bean plants and herbs. Forensic examination, primitive by modern standards but thorough for the time, confirmed Sister Rebecca's account. These women had died by strangulation, their bodies disposed of without ceremony or marker. One victim, identified as Sister Mary Collins by a small medallion of St. Bridget found with the remains, appeared to have been buried more recently than the others. The soil over her grave was barely settled, suggesting she had been killed just before or during Father Ryan's fateful visit, perhaps after delivering the note that ultimately led to the convent's exposure. The manhunt for the escaped leaders became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and even international cooperation with European authorities. However, the 3 women had vanished completely, leaving behind only the horrific evidence of their 2 decades of systematic human experimentation and trafficking. Investigation revealed that they had maintained multiple escape routes from the convent and had accumulated substantial wealth from their illegal activities. Bank records discovered during the investigation showed they had transferred enormous sums to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries over the years. The total amount exceeded $50,000, a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. Most disturbing was evidence that the operation had extended far beyond St. Mary's borders. In Chicago, police raids on 3 houses of charity in late 1858 freed 9 former nuns and 13 young women who had been living as prostitutes under various forms of coercion. The rescued women's testimonies described a system virtually identical to what had been uncovered at St. Mary's. Religious authorities had been used as cover for sexual exploitation, with wealthy clients paying premium prices for the opportunity to violate women perceived as pure or sacred. The legacy of St. Mary's extends beyond the immediate tragedy. The case contributed to a deepening of anti-Catholic sentiment in America during the 1850s and 1860s, with Protestant publications citing it, often in sensationalized form, as evidence of Catholic moral corruption. More significantly, the St. Mary's case established a pattern of institutional response to abuse that would be repeated for generations. Initial investigation, limited accountability focused primarily on direct perpetrators, protection of higher authorities who enabled through negligence or complicity, relocation of survivors to ensure their silence, and ultimately a return to institutional normalcy with minimal structural reform. The physical traces of St. Mary's Convent have been systematically erased. The demolished buildings left no visible foundation. The land, sold and resold over generations, now hosts a suburban development whose residents have no knowledge of what occurred there. Church archives relating to the case were heavily redacted during the early 20th century, with the most damning documents sealed or destroyed. Even the graves of the murdered nuns were left unmarked, their remains eventually built over without consecration or acknowledgement. Yet the story persists through scattered documents, personal journals, newspaper archives, and oral histories passed down through generations of Wisconsin Catholic families. These fragments, when assembled, reveal not just the horror of what occurred at St. Mary's, but the larger systemic failures that made it possible. The dangers of unquestioned authority, the vulnerability of isolated communities, and the human capacity for both extraordinary evil and extraordinary courage in confronting it. Father Thomas Ryan, whose determination brought the horrors to light, wrote in his final journal entry a plea that resonates across the centuries. Remember them. In uncovering their story, however incompletely, we honor that request and perhaps learn something essential about institutional power, human vulnerability, and the constant vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit sacred trust for profane purposes. What remains undeniable is that between 1854 and 1862, in the supposedly sacred confines of a Wisconsin convent, human evil reached extraordinary depths. That such evil was possible and that the systems meant to prevent it instead enabled it stands as a sobering reminder of our capacity for both depravity and denial. Perhaps the true horror of St. Mary's lies not in what happened within those limestone walls, but in how easily it was erased from history once those walls came down. Remember Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, Sister Teresa, and all the others. The shadows had grown longer since that terrible April day in 1858, but the darkness that had consumed St. Mary's Convent was far from extinguished. What investigators discovered in the months following the initial exposure would reveal that Mother Catherine Murphy and her associates had created something far more insidious than a simple criminal enterprise. They had established a template for evil that would spread like poison through the very foundations of American society. The manhunt for the escaped impostors intensified as autumn approached. Federal marshals, working with a discretion that reflected the Church's desperate desire to contain the scandal, followed leads that stretched from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. What they uncovered was a network of corruption so vast and so deeply embedded in respectable society that many investigators began to question whether complete exposure would serve justice or merely destroy the fabric of civilization itself. In September 1858, a coded telegram arrived at the Chicago office of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The handwriting, when compared to samples seized from St. Mary's, matched that of Sister Margaret Clark. She was not merely fleeing justice. She was announcing that the horror would continue in new forms, new locations, with new victims who would never be missed. The first confirmation of this chilling promise came from an unexpected source. Dr. William Matthews, the physician who had examined nuns for their suitability in the trafficking network, was found dead in his Chicago residence on October 15, 1858. His body was discovered in his private examination room, positioned in the same ritualistic manner that had characterized the murdered nuns at St. Mary's. Pinned to his chest was a note written in elegant script: "Those who serve faithfully are rewarded." The murder sent shockwaves through Chicago's medical community. Matthews had been cooperating with authorities, providing detailed testimony about the scope of the trafficking operation and the prominent clients who had paid premium prices for sessions with former nuns. His death served as both revenge and warning, demonstrating that the network's reach extended far beyond what investigators had imagined. Dr. Samuel Harrison, Matthews' colleague who had also been scheduled to testify, fled Chicago the night after the murder was discovered. His hastily scrawled note to authorities read, "They know everything. They see everything." Harrison was never seen again, though unconfirmed reports placed him in California, living under an assumed name and never again practicing medicine. The pattern of systematic elimination continued throughout the winter of 1858. Judge William Thornton, whose name had appeared in brothel ledgers as a client who particularly enjoyed sessions with pregnant former nuns, died in a carriage accident when his horses bolted without apparent cause. The accident occurred on a clear day on a road he had traveled hundreds of times, yet witnesses described the animals as behaving as though they had been deliberately startled. Bank President Charles Morrison, who had laundered money for the trafficking operation through a series of charitable donations, suffered a heart attack in his office after receiving an envelope containing only a pressed flower from the garden at St. Mary's. His widow found him clutching the flower, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror that his physician described as incompatible with natural cardiac failure. State legislator Robert Hayes, whose payments for special sessions had been meticulously documented in Mother Catherine's ledgers, announced his sudden retirement from public life, citing health concerns. He died 6 months later in a private sanitarium, having never recovered his mental faculties. As 1859 dawned, it became clear that the St. Mary's network had not been destroyed but had merely adapted. Reports began filtering in from cities across the Midwest of young women disappearing from charitable institutions, of well-dressed benefactors making generous donations in exchange for access to vulnerable populations, of mysterious deaths among those who might possess dangerous knowledge. In St. Louis, the Sisters of Mercy reported that 3 of their novices had vanished overnight, leaving behind only notes claiming they had been called to serve in frontier missions. The Mother Superior, when questioned by diocesan authorities, insisted she had approved the transfers, though she could produce no documentation and seemed oddly confused about the details. A search of her private quarters revealed a substantial sum of money hidden beneath her mattress, far more than her position could legitimately provide. In Detroit, a home for unwed mothers operated by the Sisters of Charity was discovered to be selling infants to wealthy families at prices that varied based on the children's appearance and perceived intelligence. When investigators attempted to interview the nuns responsible, they found the facility abandoned, with evidence suggesting the operation had been evacuated with military precision. The only clue left behind was a small wooden cross carved with the same symbol that had adorned the chapel at St. Mary's. The most disturbing development came from New Orleans, where the city's thriving trade in human misery had apparently welcomed new management. A brothel catering to the city's wealthiest citizens advertised authentic religious experiences featuring women who claimed to be former nuns. When local authorities, prompted by concerned church officials, attempted to investigate, they were met with legal obstacles that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Judges issued injunctions, witnesses recanted their statements, and evidence disappeared from police custody with suspicious regularity. Monsignor Kelly, despite Archbishop Hughes' attempts to recall him from active investigation, continued his pursuit of the escaped fugitives. His private correspondence from this period, discovered decades later in a sealed vault beneath the New York Cathedral, reveals a man increasingly haunted by what he had uncovered. "I fear we have awakened something that was meant to remain hidden," he wrote to a trusted colleague in Rome. The evil at St. Mary's was not an aberration but a revelation. It showed us the true face of corruption that has been growing like a cancer within the body of Christ's church. These women, these demons in sacred garments, have created a system that feeds on innocence and thrives in darkness. His letters describe encounters with church officials who seemed strangely reluctant to pursue justice, donors whose generosity came with implicit demands for silence, and powerful laymen who wielded influence that extended far beyond their apparent positions in society. Most troubling were his references to meetings where he was warned, sometimes subtly and sometimes explicitly, that certain investigations would be unwelcome to unnamed but influential parties. "I begin to understand," Monsignor Kelly wrote in what would be his final letter on the subject, "that the master referenced in the writings we found at St. Mary's may not be a single individual but rather a title, a position within a hierarchy that extends far beyond what we have uncovered. These women served something larger than their own greed or cruelty." The investigation into the St. Mary's network effectively ended in March 1859 when Monsignor Kelly suffered what was officially described as a nervous collapse. He was found in his hotel room in St. He never spoke of his investigation again, spending his remaining years in a contemplative monastery where he died in 1867, taking whatever final secrets he had discovered to his grave. With Monsignor Kelly's withdrawal from active investigation, the official pursuit of Mother Catherine Murphy and Sister Margaret Clark was quietly abandoned. The church hierarchy, faced with the choice between exposing a scandal that could destroy faith in Catholic institutions or allowing criminals to escape justice, chose the path of institutional preservation. The decision was rationalized as protecting the greater good, but survivors of St. Mary's understood it as a betrayal that compounded their original suffering. Sister Anne Sullivan, who had been working within church constraints to support other abuse survivors, wrote bitterly to a fellow survivor in 1860, "They have chosen the reputation of the institution over the lives of its victims. In doing so, they have become complicit in the very evil they claim to oppose. We who suffered at St. The network that had been exposed at St. Mary's continued to operate, adapting and evolving as it spread across the continent. Reports of similar operations appeared sporadically in newspaper accounts from the 1860s through the 1880s, though they were often dismissed as anti-Catholic propaganda or sensationalized fiction. The pattern was always the same: charitable institutions serving vulnerable populations, mysterious benefactors making generous donations, young women disappearing under suspicious circumstances, and investigations that were stymied by legal obstacles or simply abandoned without explanation. The uncensored version, sealed in government archives for nearly a century, detailed connections between trafficking operations and religious institutions in at least 12 states. The report's most chilling finding was its conclusion that the network showed signs of central coordination, with operations in different regions following identical protocols and using similar coded language. The network that had begun at St. Mary's had grown powerful enough to influence federal policy, ensuring its continued operation through the very silence that had enabled its birth. As the 19th century drew to a close, occasional glimpses of the network's continued existence surfaced in documents that investigators were never meant to see. A diary kept by a Chicago police detective mentioned raids on brothels where women spoke of being trained in sacred submission by former nuns. The most significant revelation came in 1889 when a fire at a warehouse in New York revealed hidden chambers containing what appeared to be training materials for the systematic abuse of women in religious settings. The documents, written in multiple languages and bearing the seal of various Catholic institutions, provided detailed instructions for identifying, procuring, and conditioning victims. Most chilling was the organizational chart showing connections between operations across North America and extending into Europe and South America. The fire was officially attributed to faulty wiring, and the documents were removed by federal agents before local authorities could examine them thoroughly. The warehouse's owner, listed in city records as the Sacred Heart Charitable Trust, had no verifiable address or legitimate officers. Within days of the fire, all legal traces of the organization had been erased from public records with an efficiency that suggested powerful assistance. By 1890, the network that had emerged from the ashes of St. Mary's had become something unprecedented in American criminal history. A self-sustaining system of exploitation that operated under the protection of institutional respectability and political influence. It had evolved beyond mere trafficking to encompass training facilities, financial operations, and what appeared to be ideological indoctrination that convinced participants they were serving a higher purpose. The scope of the network's influence became apparent in 1895 when a former participant, dying of consumption in a charity hospital, provided a detailed confession to a priest who later violated the seal of confession to warn church authorities. The woman, who identified herself only as Mary of the Sacred Wounds, described a hierarchy that extended from local operations to what she called the inner circle, individuals whose identities were known only to the highest levels of the organization. According to her testimony, the network had established permanent facilities in at least 20 cities, with temporary operations that could be quickly established and dissolved as circumstances required. The organization maintained detailed records of clients, victims, and collaborators, using this information both for blackmail and for ensuring loyalty. Most disturbing was her claim that the network had begun recruiting children, training them from an early age to serve in various capacities within the organization. "They call it the Great Work," she told the priest, "and they believe they serve something greater than human law or morality. They speak of preparing for a time when the old order will fall and their vision of sacred authority will rise to take its place." The priest who heard this confession, Father Michael O'Brien, attempted to bring the information to church authorities but found his reports dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman. When he persisted, he was transferred to a remote parish in Alaska, where he died in 1901 during a harsh winter that claimed several other inconvenient witnesses to the network's activities. As the new century began, the legacy of St. Mary's Convent had metastasized into something that defied easy categorization. It was simultaneously a criminal enterprise, a religious heresy, and a political conspiracy that had woven itself into the fabric of American society so thoroughly that exposing it would require destroying much of what respectable citizens held sacred. The network's ultimate goal remained mysterious, though evidence suggested it extended far beyond mere profit or gratification. Whether these represented genuine religious beliefs or elaborate psychological manipulation remained unclear, but their effect on participants was undeniable. Those who served the network displayed a devotion that transcended normal criminal loyalty. They accepted imprisonment, torture, and death rather than betray the organization's secrets. They spoke of their work not as crime but as sacred duty, and they faced their fates with the serenity of martyrs rather than the desperation of common criminals. The survivors of St. Mary's, now elderly women scattered across the continent, watched these developments with growing horror. They recognized in the expanding network the same techniques, the same rhetoric, and the same absolute certainty that they had witnessed in Mother Catherine Murphy and her associates. The evil that had consumed their youth had not died with the exposure of their suffering. It had learned, adapted, and grown stronger. Sister Anne Sullivan, in her final letter before her death in 1899, wrote, "We believed that by exposing the horror at St. Mary's we had won a victory against darkness. We did not understand that we had merely revealed a small portion of something vast and patient and utterly committed to its vision of sacred corruption." The 20th century would bring new horrors and new revelations about the network that had grown from the seeds planted at St. Mary's Convent. But those stories belong to another chapter in this dark chronicle of American religious corruption. What remains clear is that the disappearance of 23 nuns from a Wisconsin convent between 1854 and 1862 was not merely a crime, but the beginning of something that continues to cast shadows over sacred institutions even today. The women who suffered and died at St. Mary's deserved better than to become footnotes in a story too terrible for their society to confront. They deserved justice, remembrance, and the assurance that their sacrifice had prevented further suffering. Instead, they became the foundation upon which greater horrors were built. Their courage transformed into a cautionary tale about the price of speaking truth to power. As we conclude this investigation into the forgotten tragedy of St. Mary's Convent, we must ask ourselves, how many other institutions hide similar secrets? How many other victims remain forgotten? And most importantly, what shadows from our past continue to shape our present in ways we dare not acknowledge? The answers to these questions lie buried in archives that remain sealed, in testimonies that were never recorded, and in the silence that still surrounds those who would expose uncomfortable truths about the intersection of power, faith, and human cruelty. Until we find the courage to confront these shadows, the legacy of St. Mary's Convent will continue to haunt not just American history, but the very foundations of institutional trust that our society requires to function. Remember Sister Agnes. Remember Sister Bernadette. Remember Sister Teresa. Remember all those whose names we will never know, but whose suffering demands acknowledgement. Remember that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that the price of forgetting is always paid by the innocent. The darkness that consumed St. Mary's Convent was not unique to its time or place. It was a manifestation of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, enabled by our willingness to look away when truth becomes too uncomfortable to bear. The investigation into St. Mary's Convent reached its most damning phase in the summer of 1860, 2 years after the initial exposure, when federal authorities finally gained access to documents that had been hidden in a secret compartment beneath the altar of the demolished chapel. These papers, preserved by accident when workers failed to locate the hidden vault during the building's destruction, contained evidence that would shake the foundations of American Catholicism and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that had enabled Mother Catherine's reign of terror. Among the recovered documents was a leather-bound ledger in Mother Catherine's own handwriting, different from the operational records previously discovered. This journal, written in a mixture of English and Latin, contained her personal reflections on what she termed the Great Work, and revealed a woman whose criminal enterprise was driven not merely by greed, but by a twisted theological philosophy that she had spent decades developing. The Church teaches that suffering purifies the soul, one entry from 1856 read, but the Church lacks the courage to apply this truth with proper vigor. These young women, in their innocence and devotion, provide the perfect vessels for demonstrating how extreme suffering can elevate the human spirit beyond earthly concerns. More disturbing still were detailed plans for expansion that revealed St. Mary's to have been merely the first phase of a much larger operation. Her journal contained sketches of architectural modifications needed for future locations, lists of potential accomplices in other cities, and a systematic analysis of which immigrant populations would provide the most suitable victims. The documents also revealed the identity of the mysterious master referenced in Sister Elizabeth's mad ravings. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, a defrocked Anglican minister who had fled England after allegations of conducting blasphemous rituals, had been the intellectual architect of the entire operation. "My dear Catherine," one letter from 1854 began, "you understand as few do that conventional Christianity has lost its way, offering false comfort instead of necessary trial. Our work corrects this error. Each of our chosen ones experiences the fullness of human suffering, and in that extremity discovers truths about existence that the pampered faithful never glimpse." Dr. Blackwood had apparently visited St. Mary's on multiple occasions, conducting what he termed theological research on the imprisoned nuns. Sister Rebecca's testimony, given years later when she finally felt safe enough to speak, described a man of imposing presence who would spend hours questioning victims about their spiritual states during moments of extreme physical and emotional distress. He would come after the worst sessions, she recalled in a sworn statement given to federal authorities in 1863. "When we were broken in body and spirit, barely conscious from pain and terror, he would kneel beside us and whisper questions about God, about whether we felt closer to divine truth in our agony, about what revelations came to us in our darkest moments." The recovered papers also contained financial records that revealed the staggering scale of the operation's profitability. Between 1854 and 1858, the St. Mary's trafficking network had generated over $300,000 in revenue, equivalent to nearly $10 million in today's currency. This money had flowed not only to Mother Catherine and her immediate accomplices, but to a web of corrupt officials, complicit clergy, and wealthy patrons whose protection had enabled the operation to continue for so long. Most shocking of all was a detailed client list, encoded but decipherable, that included names of prominent figures from across American society. Federal judges, state legislators, wealthy industrialists, and even several high-ranking Catholic bishops had paid premium prices for access to the convent's victims. The list included specific preferences and requests that demonstrated the depth of depravity among America's supposedly respectable elite. One entry noted Senator W. Another recorded Judge M. The implications of these revelations extended far beyond the original crimes at St. Mary's. The client list revealed a shadow network of powerful men whose shared predilections had created a market for religious women that entrepreneurs like Mother Catherine were eager to supply. Federal investigators began to understand that St. Mary's was not an isolated aberration, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation that likely extended to other religious institutions across the country. Archbishop Hughes, faced with evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of the American church hierarchy, made a decision that would haunt Catholic leadership for generations. In a series of private meetings with federal authorities conducted under strict secrecy agreements, Hughes negotiated what amounted to a cover-up of unprecedented scope. The most damaging evidence would be sealed in federal archives, inaccessible for at least 50 years. The names of prominent clients would be redacted from official reports. Complicit clergy would be quietly transferred to remote assignments or encouraged to seek early retirement. In exchange, the church agreed to implement what Hughes called comprehensive reforms to prevent future abuses. These reforms, however, were largely cosmetic, focusing on improved record-keeping and more frequent inspections rather than addressing the fundamental culture of secrecy and unquestioned authority that had enabled the St. Mary's horror. The few federal investigators who objected to this arrangement found their careers mysteriously derailed. Thomas Blackwood, the lead investigator who had uncovered the client list, was reassigned to territorial disputes in the Dakota Territory, effectively ending his involvement in the case. His private journal, discovered after his death in 1889, revealed his frustration with what he saw as a betrayal of justice. "We had them," he wrote in his final entry about the case. "We had evidence that could have cleaned house from top to bottom, exposed the rot that allowed such evil to flourish. Instead, we made a deal with the devil, trading justice for social stability. Those poor women deserved better. America deserved better." The sealed evidence remained hidden until 1958, when a young archivist named Patricia Morrison accidentally discovered the misfiled documents while researching an unrelated case. Her attempts to bring the material to public attention were met with intense pressure from both government and church officials. The documents mysteriously disappeared from the archives shortly after her discovery, and Morrison herself died in a car accident just weeks later under circumstances that her family continues to question. Copies of some documents had survived, however, hidden by Morrison before her death and discovered by her sister in 1982. These fragments, while incomplete, provided enough evidence for independent researchers to piece together the broader scope of the St. Mary's conspiracy and its cover-up. Yet even today, attempts to access the complete federal archives related to the case are met with bureaucratic obstacles and claims that crucial documents have been lost or destroyed. The true number of victims may never be known. Conservative estimates based on available evidence suggest that the St. Mary's network processed over 400 women and girls through their trafficking operation between 1854 and 1862. But Dr. Blackwood's journals contained references to rural harvesting operations that may have claimed hundreds more victims from isolated farming communities across the Midwest. Most disturbing of all, evidence suggests that the network did not end with Mother Catherine's disappearance. Federal investigators documented at least 12 similar operations that emerged in different parts of the country between 1860 and 1890, each bearing the hallmarks of the St. Mary's model. Whether these represented copycat operations or the continuation of the original network under new leadership remains unknown. The psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond the original victims. Children born to nuns during their captivity, adopted into families who were told nothing of their origins, grew up with unexplained trauma and disturbing dreams. Several of these children, now adults, came forward in the 1890s seeking information about their birth mothers, only to be met with walls of silence from both church and government officials. Wrote a haunting letter to federal authorities in 1895, "I have nightmares of women in black crying out for help. Though I was told my mother died in childbirth at a respectable convent, I have birthmarks that look like rope burns, though I've never been bound. I speak Latin phrases I was never taught, always prayers for the dead." The legacy of St. Mary's Convent continues to cast shadows across American religious history. The patterns of institutional cover-up, the prioritization of reputation over justice, and the systematic silencing of victims established precedents that would be repeated in countless abuse scandals over the following century and a half. Perhaps most tragically, the conspiracy of silence meant that the lessons of St. Mary's were never learned. the structural vulnerabilities that enabled Mother Catherine's operation, the isolation of religious communities, the unquestioned authority of religious leaders, the culture of secrecy surrounding church affairs, remained unaddressed, creating conditions for similar abuses to occur again and again. Today, the land where St. Mary's Convent once stood is occupied by a suburban shopping center. Shoppers park their cars and conduct their daily business unaware that they walk over ground that once witnessed some of the most systematic evil in American history. No marker commemorates the women who suffered and died there. No memorial speaks their names, but their voices still echo for those willing to listen. In the whisper of wind through autumn trees, in the cry of ravens circling empty fields, in the dreams of descendants who carry trauma they cannot explain. The women of St. Mary's continue to call out for justice, for remembrance, for the simple acknowledgement that their lives mattered and their suffering was real. The horror of St. Mary's Convent stands as a testament to the darkest capabilities of human nature and the dangerous combination of religious authority, social prejudice, and institutional power. It reminds us that evil often wears the mask of respectability, that those who claim to speak for God may serve far darker masters, and that the price of silencing uncomfortable truths is always paid by the innocent. In remembering the women of St. Mary's, Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, Sister Teresa, Sister Mary, and all the others whose names were lost to history, we honor not only their memory but our obligation to remain vigilant against the forces that would exploit the vulnerable in the name of faith, profit, or power. The truth is far more chilling than the fiction we tell ourselves about the past. What you've witnessed in these accounts, the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women, the corruption of sacred institutions, and the conspiracy of silence that followed, represents not isolated incidents but a pattern that reveals the darkest capabilities of human nature when power operates without accountability. Each of these stories, from the medical horrors of the Convent of Eternal Tears to the trafficking network at St. Mary's, demonstrates how easily noble facades can conceal unconscionable evil. The nuns who disappeared, the women who were experimented upon, the children who vanished, they were real people with names, dreams, and families who loved them. Their suffering was not abstract but visceral, prolonged, and deliberately inflicted by those who had sworn to protect them. Perhaps most disturbing is not the existence of such monsters, but how entire systems, religious, medical, legal, and social, failed these victims repeatedly. Bishop after bishop who chose willful blindness over difficult truth. Physicians who purchased human remains without questioning their source. Communities that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable realities. The pattern persists across centuries because we, as a society, have never fully confronted our capacity for both evil and complicity. These stories matter not because they titillate or horrify, but because they remind us that vigilance is the price of protecting the innocent. The moment we assume such horrors belong only to the past, we create the conditions for their return. The same dynamics that enabled these tragedies, unquestioned authority, institutional secrecy, the silencing of victims, and society's preference for comfortable lies over difficult truths, exist today in different forms. What makes these historical accounts particularly haunting is how systematically the truth was buried, documents destroyed, witnesses silenced, Survivors relocated and sworn to secrecy, physical evidence erased from the landscape itself. The deliberate erasure was almost as evil as the original crimes because it denied the victims even the dignity of being remembered and prevented society from learning the lessons their suffering should have taught us. The recurring theme of special donations, quieting concerns, of respected institutions prioritizing reputation over justice, of powerful networks protecting their own, these patterns didn't disappear with the 19th century. They simply evolved, finding new forms and new victims in each generation. Sister Mary Collins slipping a desperate note to a farm boy. Thomas Brewster fleeing in terror from what he witnessed in the basement. Sarah Whitman escaping through frozen wilderness. These individuals chose courage over safety when everyone else chose silence over scandal. Their bravery ultimately brought these horrors to light, though often at great personal cost. The most chilling aspect may be how these operations thrived precisely because they wore the garments of respectability. The medical researchers claimed to advance science. The fake nuns invoked God's will. The corrupt officials spoke of protecting the church's reputation. Evil rarely announces itself with horns and pitchforks. It comes dressed as virtue, speaking the language of necessity and greater good. Today's equivalents may not involve convents or medical schools, but the fundamental dynamics remain. Vulnerable populations, unchecked authority, systems that prioritize institutional protection over individual welfare, and a public that often prefers not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths. The real memorial to these forgotten victims is not flowers left anonymously at memorial gardens, but our commitment to remaining vigilant against the conditions that made their suffering possible. Their names, Sister Agnes, Sister Bernadette, Sister Teresa, and all the others, deserve to be remembered not just as victims but as warnings. In the end, these stories ask us a simple but profound question. When faced with evidence of systematic abuse by respected institutions, will we be like the bishops who chose silence, or like Father Ryan who chose to act? The answer we give determines not just our character but the safety of the most vulnerable among us. The darkness these women endured was real, but so was the light that eventually exposed it, carried by ordinary people who chose extraordinary courage. That choice between complicity and courage remains ours to make every day.